Hello again. In the previous episode, we examined Washington's political window, the evolution of Europe's strategy, the buildup of ammunition production, the strengthening of the air component, and Russia's economic compression. Individually, these are challenges and opportunities. Together, they form a new context, one in which the Kremlin has less and less room to maneuver, while Kiev and its partners have more and more instruments of pressure. But one thing must be emphasized: having instruments doesn't guarantee results. Every policy comes at a cost, and every tactical success turns into a political choice. That's why the key question now is not just who has what, but how they will use it. Will the West tighten pressure to the point of pushing its opponent into systemic exhaustion? Can Moscow bargain for a pause and buy time to regroup? Or will a single misstep, political or military, trigger a sharp escalation that no one truly wants, but that might still become inevitable? In the next 3 parts, we'll go through 3 possible trajectories, from the most likely and quiet one to the most dangerous and rapid. For each scenario, I'll describe how it may unfold week by week, what early indicators to watch for, and what practical consequences it could bring, both on the front line and in politics. If you're following this topic, fix 3 things in your mind: tempo, how fast production and deliveries are changing; control, how strict verification mechanisms will be; and cost, what each side is willing to pay, economically and politically. The combination of these 3 variables will determine where we end up by year's end. Let's begin. Scenario A: controlled pressure and gradual attrition. This is a scenario of calculation and endurance, not of loud victories. Short pause. Imagine war as a vast supply machine. It doesn't just shoot and move. It lives off regular flows, trains with ammunition, fuel tanks, rotating maintenance brigades, spare parts stocks. When you disrupt this machine, not by breaking it in a single day, but by systematically cutting its arteries, the effect doesn't show up instantly as a blitz breakthrough. It appears as a chain of malfunctions that accumulate over time. That's exactly what this scenario is about. Not a spectacular victory, but systemic wear and tear. Here's how it works in practice. First come strikes on key logistical nodes, railway junctions, sorting stations, major fuel depots, repair hubs. A single hit, and several supply trains are delayed for a day or 2. One artillery battery's ammunition reserve drops for a week. A tank due back in battle in 48 hours stays in repair for another month. Each local but targeted disruption adds up, creating shortages at the front. And shortages, in turn, force commanders either to ration fire or to launch offensives with incomplete resources, both of which increase the risk of failure and losses. The enemy's reaction is predictable: redeploying air defense and guards, tightening convoy protection, rushing repairs and building bypass routes, all technically possible but costly. Moving air defense systems from one region to another thins coverage elsewhere. Escorting each train requires more vehicles and personnel. Emergency repairs drain funds and spare parts from the annual plan. So what looks like temporary rear protection, in fact, preserves the front line only short term, at the expense of depleting strategic reserves. The next turn is economic. When logistics falter regularly, the state must respond: urgent procurements, emergency borrowing, reallocation of civil budgets to military needs. In practice, this means new bond issues, tax proposals, and frozen capital expenditures, all of which have political costs: higher prices, delayed public sector salaries, reduced social payments. These feed public discontent and increase pressure on the elite, which must choose between continuing an expensive campaign or maintaining domestic stability. Operationally, 3 effects appear. First, the slowdown of offensive operations. Commanders postpone large assaults for lack of confidence in timely reinforcements or sustained artillery fire. Second, a rise in micro-failures. Small-scale attacks without full logistical backing end in heavy losses and retreats. Third, growing strategic vulnerability in the rear. Plants and terminals once deemed safe now come under fire, losing not only goods, but morale. It's important to understand, this scenario doesn't mean sudden collapse. Russia remains capable, but the nature of warfare changes. Instead of cheap, fast offensives, it's left with expensive options. Mass assaults demanding vast ammunition and mobilization logistics. The longer this scorekeeping continues, the faster political and economic resilience erodes. Fissures widen inside the elite. Some push for continuing the campaign, others for cutting costs and avoiding social unrest. These divisions surface in personnel reshuffles, propaganda tones, and budget priorities. What signs in the news would show this scenario is unfolding? Regular reports of railway standstills and ammunition delivery delays. Noticeable redeployments of air defense and statements about rear protection. Fiscal signals, emergency borrowings, new tax talks, urgent procurement orders. Mentions of accelerated repairs or purchases in third countries. Assigned domestic capacities are insufficient. Tactical shifts at the front, fewer large offensives. More local clashes aimed at squeezing the enemy where logistics are weakest. The bottom line is simple. Not a dramatic victory, not a one-day collapse, but the end of a long line of options. The system still functions, but its choices thin out. If we see recurring logistical breakdowns, rear area fortification, and emergency fiscal measures, it means systemic attrition is underway, and Ukraine gains the chance to turn local advances into strategic leverage. And this isn't abstract. Such markers already appear in field reports and media updates. Delayed trains, redeployed air defenses, emergency loans, tax debates. When these patterns repeat week after week, it's not coincidence. It's a signal of systemic pressure and logistical contraction. There's even an intriguing insider note. Reportedly, Russia's top leadership has discussed relocating certain state functions deeper inland, beyond the reach of new long-range weapons. Not a confirmed fact, but the discussion itself reveals a shift in strategic risk perception. If such plans materialize, it would clearly show Moscow moving from confidence in rear safety to fear of proximity, a political retreat inward. Scenario B, diplomacy as a tool of conflict management. When the cost of battle becomes too high for one side, it tries to shift part of the struggle into the political arena. That doesn't necessarily mean peace. More often, it's a way to buy time, ease economic pressure, and regroup while saving face. Diplomatic initiatives in such conditions are rarely born of goodwill. They're pragmatic and tactical, and their real impact depends on enforcement mechanisms. Typically, it starts with mediators, visits, talks, proposals for humanitarian corridors, or technical formats. Both sides amplify the rhetoric, promoting the theme of readiness for dialogue across propaganda and analysis channels while holding closed consultations. The political meaning is clear. For Moscow, it's a tool to soften internal pressure. For the West and Kiev, a chance to formalize limited issues and gain time to strengthen defenses under international supervision. But the effectiveness of diplomacy is measured not by words, but by mechanics. Who monitors compliance? What automatic sanctions apply for violations? And which institutions ensure oversight? The field consequences are direct. If talks come with strict verification and monitoring, they offer Kiev real time to fortify, restock, and reorganize logistics without fearing sudden strikes. For Moscow, it's an opportunity to redistribute losses and freeze part of the risk. But if verification is weak, diplomacy becomes camouflage, stockpiling, covert procurement, and repairs continue under the guise of fulfilling agreements until oversight lags behind re-escalation. Political risks are enormous. For Western capitals, engaging without strong guarantees risks losing the strategic edge. Pauses could grant the opponent valuable recovery time. For Ukraine, joining talks means a dilemma, time to strengthen, but at the risk of losing momentum and facing internal pressure to compromise. Thus, the game's essence lies not in whether to talk to Moscow, but under what conditions and who enforces them. Observable markers include a surge in mediation missions and meetings in third capitals, drafts of text mentioning observers or verification clauses, legal and financial discussions on guarantees and sanctions. Conversely, expanding repair facilities or hidden purchases in the rear signal misuse of negotiations as cover. Equally telling is domestic rhetoric. If propaganda starts framing any deal as a diplomatic victory, the leadership may be preparing to shift course internally. Practically, this scenario brings three outcomes: lower battle intensity in specific zones, time for organizational and economic adjustment, political breathing room, easing public tension and legally redistributing losses. But all that works only if transparency and enforcement exist. Without them, agreements become stage props, followed by a new combat cycle, now with replenished arsenals. What to watch in the news? Concrete steps, not just statements. Mediator visits, working group schedules, texts with verification points, legal initiatives on sanction triggers, aid packages tied to compliance, and rear logistics. If repairs and covert imports rise during talks, negotiations are likely being exploited. These together form a signal network you can track week to week. Politically, diplomacy benefits those who can control it, granting time and legitimacy. For the less capable side, it's a trap, loss of initiative and growing dependence on foreign enforcement. Each clause, each observer, each guarantee becomes a strategic asset. One must read the mechanisms, not the headlines. Scenario C, sudden escalation. Imagine one political decision shattering the entire deterrence balance, a move that redefines the limits of involvement. Not because the weapon itself is decisive, but because the Kremlin perceives it as direct foreign participation. Then logic gives way to reaction, and escalation becomes self-propelling. It starts with a formal trigger, a public, detailed confirmation of a new level of military aid, not vague discussion, but explicit disclosure of strike types and partner roles. The opposite side reacts instantly, threats accompanied by demonstrative strikes on critical targets named in rhetoric. This may come with mobilization orders, rapid redeployments, and higher alert along borders and seas. Accidental incidents multiply, an off-course missile, an airspace violation, a mishit facility, each capable of turning a local clash into a global crisis. Next comes symmetric responses in other domains, massive cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, energy sector strikes, attempts to block ports or pipelines, followed by economic and military countermeasures from allies. Markets react immediately. Volatility spikes, insurance premiums soar, fuel and air transport chains strain. For civilians, this means energy price surges, supply disruptions, and refugee flows from conflict zones. Politically, rhetoric radicalizes. Hardline voices dominate, making de-escalation difficult because backing down costs prestige. Allied governments face the same trap. Public commitments create expectations that force further action. What to watch for now? Official statements with specific timelines and delivery platforms. Sudden military readiness alerts, mass mobilizations, large-scale rail or air transfers. Border or maritime incidents causing casualties or infrastructure damage. Cyber attacks on banks, energy grids, logistics systems. Emergency allied meetings, joint defense announcements, synchronized sanctions or trade blockades. When all these unfold together, it means the conflict is leaving its local framework. The consequences are severe. Short-term, heavy casualties, infrastructure collapse, humanitarian crisis. Medium-term, a sharp reordering of global supply chains. Energy routes shift, commodity prices surge. Europe boosts defense spending and border control. Politically, tightening of regimes, censorship, and protests as economies lose revenue. And there's the constant risk of unintended widening. Chain reactions that draw alliances into direct confrontation. Reversing from that path would require delicate diplomacy and mutual guarantees rarely seen in wartime. For the observer, the key is not panic but literacy. Learn to read the signals, concrete aid confirmations, explicit threats, mobilizations, and major border incidents. When several of these coincide, escalation risk rises sharply. Track not only the battlefield but also allied reactions. Emergency G7 or NATO sessions, coordinated statements. It's never about one headline, it's the pattern that matters. Finally, a reminder. This scenario is unlikely, but its cost would be immense. Monitoring it means being ready for rapid change and understanding which events truly alter the map. So we've walked through 3 possible paths for the coming months. First, the quiet but grinding pressure and attrition model, where logistics and economics slowly erode Moscow's capacity. Second, the diplomatic phase, where pauses can benefit both sides, depending on how strictly they're policed. Third, the rare but catastrophic sudden escalation, where one decision could flip the balance and plunge the region into crisis. What matters most, none of these paths unfolds through a single headline. The next month's outcome will emerge from patterns, recurring signals forming a trend. Our task is to notice them before they cause panic. Listen to the news not as isolated stories, but as a chain of markers: train delays, air defense redeployments, emergency loans, foreign procurements, mediation visits, verification texts, and new long-range capabilities. The practical conclusion is simple. To understand where the situation is heading, watch the system, not the episodes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next episode will cover the scenario that starts to take the initiative. Thank you for watching. See you next time.